Hello and welcome to another episode of the Berners Book Club podcast. My name is Tessa Hawes and I'm the current graduate scholar here at Framlingham College. I'm joined here today with Rev B, Thom Salisbury and Anna, who studies Religious Studies A-level. So we have come together to talk about Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis in light of World Religion Day on the 19th of January. So before we begin, I just wanted to say a little bit about the book and why we've chosen it and why it's so successful. So one of the most remarkable things about Mere Christianity is that it's even more popular today than when it first came out. And it can be understood as a summary of Christian philosophy. So during the first 15 years of the 21st century, it sold more than 3.5 million copies in English alone, and it has been translated into more than 30 languages. And also, based off information from the C.S. Lewis Institute, Mere Christianity next to the Bible is the book most likely to have been read by educated Chinese Christians, which is remarkable because Mere Christianity was not originally planned as a book. It was originally a brief series of broadcasts on the BBC during the early part of the Second World War, which is pretty cool. So we've decided to focus on, because it's a pretty long book that we can't discuss all in this podcast, so we've decided to focus on Book 1, Chapter 5, which is titled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, and Book 2, Chapter 1, which is titled What Christians Believe. So without further ado, what concept does Lewis refer to when he talks about moral law, and is there such thing as absolute goodness? So, Rev B, what do you think?
Thank you very much. Yeah, obviously, wearing my Rev B hat, I'm going to agree with this idea that C.S. Lewis talks about a moral law. But before we get there, maybe we should just unpack some of the phraseology he uses, because in the book he actually talks about it as the law of nature, natural law. When we talk about natural law these days, we tend to talk about gravity and things that we can measure, where he's actually talking about moral law, some kind of absolute good or evil. And yes, as you say, I'm inclined to agree with that idea, and I would suggest that it is from that position of having a moral absolute that we make all our moral decisions. And I'll be interested to see what the panel say in conversation. It almost, for me, it's a bit like C.S. Lewis saying the laws of nature are what makes things happen. So apples fall from trees because of gravity. Gravity makes it happen. He would call that a law of nature, and we would call it a law of nature. But when C.S. talks about the law of nature, he's talking about the law of human nature. And he's actually arguing what would or what ought to happen is actually a law. And so God has engineered the universe suggesting that things ought to happen. There's some kind of absolute imperative by which we should go. That fits in very nicely with the Christian model, because there is this perfect God, and this perfect God has a perfect plan, and that perfect plan involves myself, Mr. Salisbury, Anna, and yourself. Hooray. But not all people agree with that. And I suspect that Mr. Salisbury might have a slightly different perspective on this idea of C.S. Lewis, that there is such a thing as moral or absolute law. Am I right?
Yeah, I, broadly, yes. Although reading this again, having not read it for quite a while, it was always nice to find something that was new in it that kind of stood out to me that I hadn't sort of seen before. But yes, broadly, I would say that the general idea of an absolute good and moral law is problematic from a philosophical perspective. Whether you take the kind of approach of a lot of philosophers who try to suggest that when you do propose there must be a moral and absolute law, you've got issues around how you find out what that is. The Christian faith has a text, the Bible, which you can discover some of these things, but those things could be divinely uncovered in some ways, or through sort of divine inspiration or something like that. But the general thing I would say about, I guess, the thing I read in this chapter that I thought maybe was the bit that I would pick up on here is the fact that he kind of makes this claim that with this moral law, morality is a really difficult thing to do. And I don't know whether I agree with that specifically or not, because I think a couple of things he says is, if God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. The moral law is hard as nails. I like that phrase. It's like, it sounds like a good phrase to use. But he then goes on to talk about the fact that, and again, this is the phrase that stood out to me. The sentence that stood out to me. If there is a moral law, if there is an absolute moral law, then we are this is directly quoting. Then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day. And are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow. That kind of stood out to me. It's like, wow, that's tough. Yeah. So I basically I'm going to fail to reach the standards of this absolute goodness, and I can try to kind of I had a good go at it today, but even tomorrow we're going to find it tough, and I think that's the bit probably from the text that I would take away and say, I struggle with that a bit. I would want morality to be something not easy, but not that difficult. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah. That's where I would sort of take issue with it.
And so he's coming from that premise of what we would call as Christians original sin, the fact that we are fallen creatures. And that's what he's arguing. He's saying that there is such a thing as this absolute, and guess what? None of us are there, and none of us can really get there in our own steam without God's help. But as you said, Mr. Salisbury, that immediately puts you on the back foot, because you're reading it and you're feeling like you failed. You've fallen short of these so-called absolutes.
And especially because we even like teaching our children, but teaching students at schools, and we always like try to say to them, be a good person, go out into the world and be. And this kind of almost stood out to be a kind of like, well, yes, good, but you're always going to be a little bit sort of falling short of that standard, because of that idea of the absolute goodness. Things can be good, but they're not that absolute goodness. Yeah.
So how do we actually know what this moral absolute is? Yeah, and when I were wrestling with this passage beforehand, that was for you the hardest thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, I suppose I think if there is an absolute goodness, which I'm not firstly sure if there is, because I suppose most things are subjective, and it would obviously need a higher power like God, or like the forms for Plato, something that's like bringing it towards, or like an ideal. And I think that's a hard concept to grasp in the first place. And then if that is true, then how, as humans, can we figure that out? And I don't think
it was the figuring it out bit. That's kind of what, how can we discover what this absolute goodness is? And I think that I mean, I don't know, Rev B, I mean, I find that a lot of people simplify it to the kind of the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, or all these things, which are important within that absolute goodness. But is there a general conception of I don't know where we can discover this, other than maybe in sort of parts of the Bible or something? I don't know. Yeah,
I think from what I'm getting with C.S. Lewis is that it is a conscious feeling. It is. So this word ought to behave. In the book that this brilliant book, he does say things that no matter how many times you do things wrong, there are levels of good and bad, but people tend to know if they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing.
Like an inherent.
And that's his moral law that he's talking about, how we ought to behave.
And sorry, because I just know that there's this bit in this chapter that he says that, doesn't he? He says, therefore, this moral law has nothing to say to people who do not know that they have done anything to repent of, and who do not feel that they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a real moral law. That's the bit that it's like that realization of, okay, there is something that is of this objective standard, this absolute out there. Yeah. But does that come? I mean, just from your personal opinion, does that come from? is that part of conversion maybe as well, or can you get there sort of once if you realize God exists, if that's the kind of, do you at the same time realize the absolute goodness exists? Does it come as a package or?
Not necessarily. So absolute goodness is a philosophical concept, and that's something we have to create. So you have to create just like you say 1 + 1 is 2 mathematically. There's no way you can show mathematically. It's a philosophical concept that you have to accept, that 1 + 1 is 2. You have to philosophically accept that there is an absolute goodness. But somewhere in the whole Christian narrative is this idea of sin, that you are a fallen creature. And that's what you just pointed out. Anna, you're a Christian, and there's some stage in your life where you would have realized that you are a sinner without making you feel guilty, because we're all sinners according to but so what Mr. Salisbury is arguing there, have you ever had that moment in your life where you thought, yeah, actually I do get it wrong? Have you ever felt like you are what C.S. Lewis calls the sinner? Do you ever feel like that?
I mean, definitely. I think everyone does. It's like, well, everyone feels that they aren't doing exactly as they should, maybe. And I suppose it's just part of being human, that you can't get it right all the time, but you kind of have to understand in a way, or think that you aren't getting it right, in order to try and get it right. Like he said in I think the first book about if you're on the wrong path, and then the wisest man is the one who turns around the quickest. So it's kind of trying to, like, they're the most progressive by turning around and realizing that what they're doing isn't exactly right.
It's great that you picked that up, because I when I again rereading this, that visual metaphor of the walking down this kind of path. I did sort of think about myself there. I know Rev B and I we've had conversations about these things before, about my own personal journey with faith and religion and Christianity and these things. But yeah, I did see myself a bit as a bit of a kind of I'm still going down the path a bit. And I sort of said, oh, okay, maybe I should be turning around or something. But it's an interesting sort of way to phrase it, because it's like, yeah, you sort of almost taking that moment to actually reflect that just going down that path further and further doesn't lead you in the right direction here. Yeah.
I'm picking up two strands here, Mr. Salisbury. One is that the idea that there is this path and we're going down, and we suddenly realize the word conversion does mean turn around. And that's what C.S. Lewis is using. And so there is that aspect, and that's where Christianity plays a big part in the notion of conversion. But there's also the other idea of C.S. Lewis is saying you can only imagine a squiggly line if you know what a straight line looks like. And that is going back to your question about the absolute goodness. He is arguing that there is a moral law, an absolute goodness. And I'd like to know, just where does that come from? Where do we get the sense that there is a straight line? Because none of us have seen the straight line. Jesus arguably is the closest we get. But we've not seen a straight line, have we? So, and yet we would all around the room probably agree that there is such a thing as a straight line in moral terms. Is that fair or not?
I think so, but I don't know if there's an exact thing that is the ideal of goodness and what perfect goodness is. And I don't that's unchangeable, I suppose, unless it is God. But then Mrs. Salisbury and I were discussing about your three frame?
Yeah, you three frame.
About how if it is God, then how does just anything he says become good because he says it, or if it's something outside of God? And I just think it's a hard thing to understand.
It is a tough dilemma.
I think that's the problem, because we are humans, we aren't God, so it's harder for us as humans to comprehend something that the divine figure understands. I think that's where the hard part where it rests.
Because then you need like I said, reference to the Bible earlier, you need some form of something to communicate his goodness to humans, either in the form of divine revelation or a biblical text that kind of outlines, which I guess is, to a certain extent, I guess is why the Ten Commandments exist. We could make that claim in the fact that they needed that, didn't they? That they needed these tablets that kind of said, well, actually, look, you're not getting it quite right here. Yeah. I'm going to give you the straight line almost. I'm going to give you that kind of codified set of rules that can help you understand what I'm wanting.
Yeah, there is the moral imperative from the Ten Commandments from God effectively on Mount Sinai. But I think for the Christian and for C.S. Lewis, it's more the life and testimony of Jesus. Yeah. That is the moral law that we would need to follow. Yeah. Which is why book 3 talks all about Jesus's teachings. Yeah.
So should we move on to book 2 now? What the Christians believe. I had a question for the panel. What is the difference between a pantheistic conception of God and a theistic conception of God? And where does the Christian sit in their view of God according to Lewis? Mr. Salisbury, shall I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I get the general sort of difference between pantheism and theism. I mean, theism is a belief in God, is as a term. Pan describes sort of everywhere, all. So the pantheism is that God is in everything, in all parts of the universe. And there are different conceptions of pantheism across sort of religious and philosophical literature. But the idea that God is in everything and everything is God and the universe is God, and these kind of phrases are thrown around, which does sort of not. I mean, I would say it doesn't necessarily. You wouldn't reject that if you're a theist necessarily, because you could incorporate an idea that God is sort of in everything. God is immanent in the world and immanent in our lives, immanent in our bodies and our souls, whatever. But certainly this. I mean, certainly as C.S. Lewis puts it, in terms of this theistic conception, is someone who is not just sort of outside of. He talks about being beyond good and evil as a pantheistic conception, and that's not really something that the theistic conception of God within a Christian context would work, because God is either the source of all goodness or the absolute goodness, and therefore needs to. He's not beyond it; he is part of it in some sense, and but I mean, I think when you're dealing with these two concepts. You can get a bit blurred between them, but I think this theistic conception is generally this. It comes with a set of beliefs around the salvation, I guess, as well, in terms of God's role in the world, in terms of saving us from our original sin, as we talked about earlier, and things like that. So it comes with a set of kind of premises and assumptions with it as well. But I don't know if that helped.
I think that certainly did outline it. But did you have a differing view, Rev B, or a similar stance on the matter between pantheism and?
Well, I get, as Mr. Salisbury is saying, I get the idea of what he's trying to do. He's trying to distinguish the God of atheism from the God of theism. And when he talks about theism, he's embracing all religions. He says they all fall into the same pot of believing that there is a God. Some beliefs are perhaps a little bit more well-refined than others, but he says they all have this idea of a God. But the idea of pantheism is that the painter and the painting are not separate. So if you're looking at a painting, that painting has the artist inside the painting. And C.S. Lewis has a problem with that. He says if God made the world, he's like the artist. Yeah. He's the painter, but his creation is the painting. And you can destroy the painting without destroying the painter. Yes. And so he's trying to keep God alive. But it'll be interesting to see what Anna says, because in his attempt to try and keep God alive, as Mr. Salisbury is saying, he kind of moves God out of the picture. Yeah. And that causes a moral dilemma for us as humans, because if he is the painter and he's made this painting and he's now stepping back, so yes, he ticks the box that he's not a pantheist, he's a theist, and God is alive, but then we face this dilemma, well, if he's done this, where is he now in this world of suffering and evil and pain? Where is this artist now? And and Anna might have something to say about it, because suddenly God is not in his painting. So it does cause me a few problems to think of him, as the painter. I'd want him to be part of his creation, which does open the door for me being a mini pantheist. Because I want him to be in his creation to a degree, don't I?
Yeah, and I guess that's always the tension between something like a transcendent being and an immanent being that you're trying, but God always, a theistic conception of God almost can incorporate both of those, right? He's outside of time and space, but he's inside time and space, and
because we allow for the paradox.
Because yeah. So it's possible to have those, but I think when a lot of, if you're adopting a pantheist view, you're certainly wanting them to be something that is a little bit apart from us. Yeah, although it's part of us in some way.
But he's definitely a part.
Yeah.
And where do you see God, Anna? Do you see him as this pantheist deity in his creation, or do you see God as separate, like C.S. Lewis is arguing in Book 2?
I think as part of creation, I'd say, because I feel the other view is more, perhaps just more of a response to like the universe being not exactly what you would imagine a god to be like. So as in the universe is a beautiful place, but it's not perfect, perceived by us as perfect, perhaps. So I suppose the theistic view is more like adopts Vardy's theory of a God that steps back from his creation, and that's why there's evil in the world.
But you like the idea of a personal God.
Yeah.
God, the Christian, the word we use is incarnate. God is in flesh, in Jesus. So you like the idea of God in person.
Yeah. I feel he can be both, though, obviously, through the Trinity.
I was thinking about the Trinity.
Yeah. Because obviously God, as I suppose the Father, is more transcendent and is the creator. And then Jesus as just one of us, and being able to understand human suffering, and that's the most personal you can get to another person, is understanding how they feel, I suppose. And then just the Spirit as being everywhere, I suppose.
There's a bit of pantheism coming in, just the word everywhere. So God is everywhere, almost pantheistic, hey?
Yeah.
But I guess some of what Lewis writes here about the point of view, because he talks about the way you perceive things, especially within the pantheistic conception. Like he says, we call a cancer bad. They would say, I think he's talking about the pantheist here, because it kills a man. But you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. So you're just sort of depending on your perspective. He said it all depends on the point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in the other. So it's that kind of notion that there is, again, going back to this absolute goodness thing, right? There's a God who wants certain things and who desires certain things of the world, and certainly has his own conceptions of what is right and wrong and what should be, but maybe as even not necessarily in a pantheist view, but this notion that you look at things in this kind of very detached manner. You don't look at cancer as being bad because it's just a thing in the world. It's just a thing that happens, and it's a random. If we talk biologically, evolutionarily, it's a random mutation, and it attacks cells, and it does these things. And you to add that layer of bad onto it is something that a theistic conception of God can allow you to do within a moral universe.
He one of the lines that he uses is, God insists very loudly that we need to put it right again. Yeah. And I read that and I thought, but does he? I don't get too many people walking around feeling guilty that the way they're living, do we? It's almost like in his head, God insists very loud. And I get his idea about trying to save society. But Anna, do you think people are getting a sense that God is speaking very loudly to society and telling them what they're doing is wrong?
I don't think so. Definitely not, because obviously society's becoming more and more secular every day. So it's almost as though people are moving further away from God than towards Him.
They're not hearing any
Yeah.
loud conversations from God, are they?
No.
I don't know. Yeah, but I don't know. Because even reading that just this week and then hearing you say that, I took a completely different take on it.
Okay.
Because I wonder whether then, you know, those, I guess, I don't want to talk for anyone else, but you know, those moments when you kind of, it's the conscience, right? Maybe it's the conscience. It's the voice that isn't loud out here. It's not this booming voice that comes down from the heavens, but it's very loud in your head when you're alone
And I guess
with your own thoughts, right?
It's the thing of the just or the unjust in your mind. He spoke about how in your inner mind you know whether something is just or unjust, and how do you know that?
Yeah.
And so it goes back to our very first sentence, the question you asked right at the beginning: is there such a thing as absolute just goodness? You know, is there a moral law?
And he doesn't necessarily reference conscience, right? But that's what I've taken from that in this conversation, is that this voice that is very, like I said, it's very pronounced because it doesn't leave you. You know, you've done something wrong. It's niggling. It's there, and actually you tend not to be able to quench that voice unless you then atone. You make up for the transgression, right? You do something to make up for it, and then that kind of it's almost as if God's like shouting at you, and then well done, you've made up for it, and I'll leave you alone for a bit, and then. And
yet, you know, I have a fridge magnet at home which says if you obey all the rules, you miss out on all the fun. And actually, the Rev B speaking here, but actually I don't like just obeying the rules and doing the right thing all the time. Is that wrong?
But you probably need that. You probably need that voice, right? Because otherwise, again, maybe like the straight road we were talking about, like unless you veer off. I don't know. Unless you veer off the road, then
you don't know
you can't,
the straight road.
And then the voice gives you that sort of clear conception of what the straight is. The straight, and we know what the straight and narrow is because we kind of veer off and realise that maybe that was the.
Nice. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a very thought-provoking discussion. I hope those listening have found out a little bit more about mere Christianity and would want to read it further. Before we wrap up, I think Rev B wants to share a poem from C.S. Lewis himself to inspire some young minds out there.
Yeah, he has got lots of very good quotes in a number of his books, and this is just a quote which I'll leave you with. This is C.S. Lewis saying, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen today, not only because I see that the sun has risen today, but also because it is in the sun that I can see everything."